In this video, I'm going to be talking about using the Fujinon 50mm to 135mm T2.9 Cine lens zoom on the Sony FX6. Here's the story. In this video today, I've got two different types of example footage to show you. The first lot of examples is with the lens on a tripod using the Sony FX6, and the second lot of examples is going handheld using a cinesaddle and the Sony FX6 and the Fujinon 50mm to 135mm T2.9 Cine lens. So here's the setup I had on the tripod, and operating the lens was actually quite easy for me. Being on a tripod, it means I don't really have a lot of room to move around. In fact, I don't really have much room to move around at all. And having a zoom lens on this shoot was really helpful to get a lot of different types of shots that I wouldn't necessarily have been able to get with a standard prime cine lens. So the first thing I need to mention about this lens is it is a super 35mm lens. It's not a full frame lens, and I'm shooting with the Sony FX6 and I am shooting in 4K, and in 4K the Sony FX6 can't go into a super 35 mode. If you have the Sony FX9, it can do that because that's got a 6K sensor, I believe, whereas the Sony FX6 has a 4K sensor. And if you're recording in 4K, then there isn't that extra resolution for the camera to crop in on the sensor to give you that super 35mm mode. So what I've done is I've used the clear image zoom on the Sony FX6 in the 4K mode and zoomed into 1.5, which is the maximum zoom you can zoom in on in this function. This then gets rid of any of the vignetting around the edges and then gives you a full frame image. One thing to take note with clear image zoom is if you do use it, it does disable any autofocus you may have with your lens. However, with this lens being a manual cine lens, there is no autofocus, so that's not really a problem in this scenario. Adding the clear image zoom then changes this lens from being a 50mm to 135mm lens to a 75mm to a 202.5mm lens. And here's an example of the Sony 24 to 105 f4 lens at 50mm, and then this is the Fujinon 50mm to 135mm lens with the clear image zoom added to it. So you can see that 50mm is a little bit wider with the full frame Sony lens than it is with the Fujinon lens with the clear image zoom added. Overall, I found the usability of this lens quite good. I was using a small rig follow focus to get some of the focusing shots on the tripod. When I did have the follow focus attached to the rig, I did find it a little bit hard to get my hands in to change the focal length of the lens. And then that made me want to take the follow focus off just so I had a little bit more room to move around the lens going from focus to changing the focal length. There are little mounting points on the zoom, so if you do want to get a zoom lever or a zoom wand or a zoom stick, as I've seen them referred to online, if I was to use this lens in the future, I might look at investing into getting one of those just to make changing the focal length just a little bit easier. For most of these shots, the aperture was between T2.9 and T4, and I didn't go any lower than that because I wanted to try to get as much separation between the subject and the background as much as possible, especially getting the lights in the background as well. You can see in some of the footage that once you get the fairy lights towards the edge of the frame, it does go a little cat's eye-ish, but the more that you're in the center of the frame, the fairy lights are a lot more rounder and more pleasing to the eye. It's not a deal breaker for me for using this lens, but it is just something to be aware of. And overall, using this lens for this particular type of video project was quite enjoyable, and I really did like the image that it was producing. And the second lot of examples I've got for you in this video is going handheld for some event coverage. And I wanted to go handheld for these shots because I wanted to have that little bit of movement, and I didn't want to be locked off to a tripod. I find that with event coverage, if you're able to be as quick and as nimble as possible without having a tripod, it just makes it that much more versatile and easier for you to get a variety of different types of shots. I was using a cinesaddle to try to get the shots to be as stable as possible, but because this is a bit of a long lens, there is a little bit of movement. And that's one of the reasons why I shot it in 50p, so I can slow it down and try to smooth out the shots as much as possible. Once again, I was using the Sony FX6 for these shots, and the outdoor shots, I was using the electronic variable ND and had that on auto. And I found that to be really helpful, especially using this lens outside, because all I need to really worry about was the framing and the focus, and I didn't need to worry about the aperture or the exposure as I was outside, because the auto ND would automatically change the shot and make sure that my exposure was correct. And because this day was partly cloudy and the sun was coming in and out, this was really helpful and just one less thing I had to worry about when trying to get the shots. Another thing to note, I was using the Sony FX6 in custom mode when it comes to the picture profile. So that allowed me to apply no LUT, which means that I'm shooting in S-Log3, and then I was able to monitor what I was shooting with my Shinobi and have a custom LUT added there. And I used the custom LUT that I typically use when I'm editing as well. So I knew what the footage was going to look like when I get it into the editing suite. I used custom mode because I wanted to be able to add extra dB into the image and try to get the exposure as close to correct as possible. And so far, I found this to be a very helpful way to make sure that I've got the shot when I don't have complete control over the lighting conditions that I'm shooting in. This lens also has a macro function as well, which allows you to get closer to the subjects that you're recording. And this just adds another level of versatility to the lens, which allows you to film items or people a little bit closer than what you would be able to normally without the macro feature. So overall, I was really happy with how this lens performed. As long as you're aware of the limitations that it has, it is a Super 35 lens, so you will need to use the clear image zoom on your Sony cameras like the FX6 or the A7S III. And although the name says it's 50 to 135, it really is 75 to 202.5. The lens is also surprisingly light as well, so you don't need to have lens support on the end of the camera. Just to be careful, I tried using my small rig lens support and it actually wasn't long enough to be able to support the lens. But I did operate the camera without a lens support and I didn't feel like it was going to break the E-mount or anything like that. So take that for what it's worth. So when would I use this lens? Well, I did find it to be quite an enjoyable experience to be able to use when getting different B-roll shots, which didn't need to have critical focus all the time. If you're recording something like someone walking towards the camera and you want to make sure that you've got them in focus the entire time, unless you're really well trained with manual focus and someone walking towards the camera, I'd probably reach towards a Sony autofocus lens like Sony 70 to 200mm instead of this lens, because you'll be able to use that face-eye autofocus and know that you're going to have that subject in focus the entire time. With this lens, it does have a lot of room for user error, and unless you're really confident with your focus pulling, I would suggest using the autofocus lenses if you have to have your shot in focus every single time. But if you like the look that this lens gives you and you're comfortable with operating manual focus, then this lens is definitely usable for a wide variety of projects. It's not necessarily a cheap lens, but it is quite versatile and definitely something that is worth investing into if you're comfortable with the manual focus aspect of it. And that's the video. I hope you found it helpful, and if you did, please give it a like. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to this channel for more videos on video creation in the future.